dive into a number of hormones that affect belly. And, some of it will apply to you, some of it may not, but it's still to be aware of that. So the first thing is thyroid. Your thyroid is, everybody has a thyroid, and it completely regulates your metabolism, right? The thyroid gland dictates how your body will use energy. And if it doesn't produce enough thyroid, it can cause everything in your body to slow down and accumulate more fat in the midsection. So if your thyroid doesn't function well, you can possibly gain more weight in the middle. Thyroid malfunction often is partially genetic, or too much iodine in your system, but it can largely, I'm not saying all of it, I do know some of it is genetic. It can be affected a lot by your lifestyle and the way you eat. And if you don't if the body's often very off balance, this is where thyroid issues can come about. But there is a genetic factor. I'm not completely ruling that out. But if you have thyroid issues, you will more likely accumulate fat in your midsection. And that midsection weight gain can also be from fat. That midsection gain is not always about fat. It's actually accumulation of salt and water. So that's also partially why, women, when I first train them, they can drop a lot because they're just holding on to so much water and bloating and all of that, right? So a lot of the accumulation of weight in the middle is salt and water. And that's why I'm very particular what you eat. I often want to look at your ingredients, the ones that I coach, right? So that's the first thing. Hi, Wan. Hi, Ann Winters. Okay, so the second thing is cortisol. So I speak about this a lot because cortisol is the hormone that under high stress, you get excreted this type of hormone. And cortisol creates fat distribution into your face, your back, and your stomach, okay? And continuous cortisol stress will not only make your belly go bigger, but if you have high levels of stress, this can cause eventually diseases, and is related to diabetes and connected. I'm not saying it's always a causation, they're connected. And there's something called Cushing's disease, which that fat, you'll start to see more fat accumulate into your back, into your upper back, which is like a hump on your back, in the middle of the back. You will accumulate fat around the neck, and you'll accumulate in the belly, and they have very skinny legs. Yeah. So some of you that come to see me start looking a little bit like that. It's very skinny in the legs, but just that midsection and that upper is holding a lot. But obviously you have to hit a certain level to be a disease. So it's just to understand that cortisol creates a lot of belly fat accumulation. How many of you struggle with cortisol? Oh yeah, Tina just raised her hand. She's ready. She's ready to say I'm stressed, cortisol. Yeah. How many of you struggle with a lot of cortisol? That is a huge reason why you probably have a lot of belly fat. I've met so many women that are in survival mode. And in fact, because I do life success development coaching as well. One of the things I just spoke to one of the gals, and if she watches this live, she'll know, is, are you always in survival mode? Do you feel like you're always in crisis mode? And she said, yes, I am. My whole life I've been in crisis mode and stress mode. And right now she's struggling to lose in the midsection area, which is partially why, because you're so stressed, right? Tina, you do as well. Yeah. So if you are struggle with cortisol, put cortisol below, because that hormone is one of the big reasons why you're gaining in the midsection. Obviously, this live isn't just about cortisol. I have done a live just on cortisol, but I will talk a bit about it at the end. Okay. So the third hormone is leptin. Okay, so I've spoken about leptin a lot. Leptin is the hormone that triggers nerve cells to the hypothalamus that tells your body when you're full. The opposite hormone is ghrelin, which ghrelin allows you to be feel hungry and want more food, okay? So the thing is, fat cells produce leptin, okay? So the more fat cells you have, the more leptin that you will produce, which you would think that actually that will help you feel less hungry, right? Because you have more fat cells and it produces more leptin. However, for those of you who understand about insulin is the hormone that regulates blood sugar. And when you have too much insulin in your system, which is when you have a lot of sugar enter your body, insulin starts to malfunction, right? And this is how people start to become pre-diabetic or diabetic, when there's so much need for insulin that like the body starts to like kind of freak out and like, what's going on? Why is there so much insulin? And then like cells stop responding to insulin. Eventually your organ stops producing insulin, all of this type of stuff. And now if you have problems producing insulin, you're in trouble, right? This is how people get into diabetic or diabetic conditions. So why do I bring this up? Because actually insulin is part of one of the hormones that influences belly fat, but leptin is very similar. So if you start producing lots of leptin signals in your body, you could potentially create leptin resistance. And leptin resistance is when your leptin starts to malfunction. So when your leptin starts to malfunction, you really don't know when you're really hungry and when you're not. And maybe you're never hungry. Like a lot of the women I coach, when they first come to me, and I always say to them, that's not a good thing if you are not hungry. I always say that to them because they're like, oh, I like to just eat 900 calories, So your leptin can malfunction by over sending leptin signals. And when leptin resistance occurs, it will cause potentially more accumulation of fat in your midsection. Okay. So this is another thing, is the crab cakes are causing cortisol. Yes, Rosalinda, but it also does other things, which I'll talk about later, which is about what it does for your body. That helps your metabolism. So I know you're joking, Rosalinda, you're so funny. So in terms of leptin resistance, so if your body has high amounts of fat right now, so the ones who are listening, if you have fat on your body or you have a big belly, this is why it is so important to reduce the belly, because the more fat you have on you, the more likely you're going to produce a malfunction or a pathway that's not very healthy. So that's kind of one of the reasons too, is like, if you're like, I keep having this like fat or belly fat, it just won't get better, is partially this type of hormonal signal. Okay. Now, inflammatory markers. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about in hormones is about inflammatory markers, because inflammatory markers are hormones too, right? So one of the things is, okay, go back to the title, is why is belly fat so hard to lose? So the reason is because belly fat, I said earlier, is an active type of fat, and it releases different types of hormones. And the belly fat, hormones that it releases is highly inflammatory. So there were studies that they've done where they've actually tried to measure the blood flow from the belly fat. There's something called the hepatic portal vein, very close to the belly fat. So more specifically, just to make sure people understand, is when I talk about belly fat, often I'm talking about visceral fat. So visceral fat is the fat that surrounds your organs. It's very close to your organs, okay? So if it's super close to your organs, it's more dangerous for your body because it's sitting close to the organs. And a lot of the blood from your belly fat, visceral fat, sits close to the hepatic portal vein, which then sends the blood through and then redistributes it, which means if these active fat cells are producing inflammatory markers, your body is being flooded with inflammatory markers throughout the body. So when they did this study, they measured the blood flow from the hepatic portal vein, and they found obviously the blood coming from those visceral fat areas had a high in interleukin 6, IL-6, and C-reactive proteins. Those two are very inflammatory markers, and they're kind of closely connected. Again, it's not always a cause, it could be a correlation with things that could cause cancer and other faster aging, atherosclerosis, which is hardening of arteries. So they found like these types of proteins that are being released out of the visceral fat area is incredibly inflammatory. So the bigger your belly is, the more dangerous it is. And maybe before you knew this, but you didn't know the scientific basis in it, right? So the scientific basis is because what's being pushed through your bloodstream from your visceral fat area is all inflammatory, right? So, but yes, in terms of the high levels of inflammatory markers, one of the things I speak a lot about, and women will always ask me, why are you so particular with certain inflammation markers or things that we eat? And that's because if you have belly fat, you don't have the privilege to eat like a 20-year-old, because if your system is being flooded with inflammatory markers all the time, you have to be more vigilant and take out those factors, and not go into sort of like this, like, but I used to eat that and there was nothing wrong. Or like, I hear that 20, 30-year-olds can eat this and there's nothing that happens to their body. And this is going back to this whole concept of like, but by nature, your belly fat, if it started to accumulate because of different hormonal issues, you're causing massive inflammation all the time in your system. So that's why you have to be even more vigilant about what you eat. And just to, give a little bit of, I always poke fun at Oshone, but Oshone is young. She doesn't have that inflammatory marker that runs through her system, right? So it's like her eating a donut or all these types of things is not going to have as much effect on her as it does you. So as you age, you just have to understand, especially if you have a belly, that you need to be a little bit more conscious of this. So, and okay, also one more thing. In terms of inflammation and leptin, which I discussed above, leptin resistance is highly caused by inflammation, okay? So this is one of those problems with the belly fat, is that belly fat by nature produces inflammation. Belly fat by nature has fat cells, which by nature then produces more leptin, which then also is influenced by inflammation, which then makes it worse, right? So it becomes this whole issue of, is this an egg, like the chicken or the egg story, right? Is it because you have more fat, then you have leptin, then it causes inflammation, or is it because you have more fat, then it causes inflammation, then it causes leptin, and right? Like, it's like, there's probably not a set pathway. A lot of it is interconnected, but it's to just understand why it's so complicated. It isn't just so simple, like just eat less or just exercise more, right? So how many of you struggle with high inflammation in your body? So put inflammation below if you know, like, you struggle with inflammation. So put that below if you're like, yeah, I know that my body's constantly inflamed, or maybe just the food that you eat, that it's just not doing the best for you. And sometimes how you'll know, I'm not saying it's always, but I know most of my clients who work with me, if they previously had a lot of joint pain, kind of like how they feel it in their body, they feel like their body's like inflamed, or their joints, whereas once they get onto a better way of eating, their joints really don't hurt as much anymore.